while I think my generation and older have done a really solid job destroying this planet. Um, and I certainly don't want to put the responsibility or the onus on the younger generation, but I really hope that we start to see some solid work being done on the environment. It is past time for action, and I do want to see, and I think when we talk about the environment and climate change, that in and of itself is too broad, right? When we look at certain areas of making better choices or making better decisions, it's easy then to forget that some of those choices and decisions also have um, devastating possibilities to them. So I would really like to see a kind of a grown-up actions plan for taking care of this planet. I am always interested in education, and I'm always disappointed because politicians prior to election day spend so much time talking about education and the value of education, and the importance of educating all of our children. And quite frankly, as much of a critical media literacy scholar as I am, I get sucked into it and I get really hopeful. And then I remember after election day that that's pretty easily forgotten because those under 18 don't vote. So those who are most impacted by educational policy actually have the least amount of say in it. So I'm prepared to be disappointed, and yet will remain somewhat hopeful that we could potentially start talking about education. I'd also like something like policy and regulation to be stripped of its kind of dirty word quality. We need greater social safety nets, and that's not a bad thing. There's nobody in this country that hasn't had some level of support. And in fact, our top billionaires, some of their early funding was government support, it was public funds. Um, and I'd like somebody to be able to start talking about that as a good thing. We are the richest nation in the world who still has embarrassingly abject poverty and housing insecurity and food insecurity, and for that we should be greatly ashamed. And it is not a dirty word to say that folks deserve support, and that our government, who is there to be for the people, of the people, by the people, should absolutely be supporting those folks, because that supports all of us.
I think, in the 2023 yearbook, we have at least 3 stories about the role of dark money in politics, and this isn't only electoral politics. It's Supreme Court justice nominations, the whole gamut of what politics consists of. So I would say, and one of those stories in the book is about how there are efforts in state legislatures across the country to make it more difficult to track dark money in politics. So when you see the conditions for the production and dissemination of information, when you see those conditions being undermined, that's something that frightens me. I also think, and this is probably something that everyone answering this question is gonna comment on, the framing of all news, not just election campaign news, in terms of red versus blue horse races. That's only going to be worse in the coming 12 months. It's a pervasive news frame for the corporate media. How does this play out in terms of the politics of the Republicans and the Democrats? And there are occasions where I think that is newsworthy in and of its own right, but many stories I think are distorted as a result of that focus on, in effect, kind of the horse race or the inter-party competition between Democrats and Republicans.
It's hard not to fall into despair. I'm pretty convinced that by November, whatever, once the votes are counted, 2024, either Biden will have been reelected or Trump would have been elected again. And, honestly, barring any exceptional circumstances, the outcomes are pretty terrifying. I think there's a good chance that if Biden wins the Electoral College, we'll have a resurgence of everything that we saw in 2020, of refusal to accept actual election results, leading to political violence. I think the chances of political violence recurring are really quite high. I hate to say that, but I think that's what a rational analysis would suggest. If Trump wins the Electoral College, then we're slated to 4 more years of Trump, which I think any concerned citizen should be very, very worried about. So I wish I could sort of finish our little conversation today on a higher, more optimistic note, but I'm afraid I'd be dishonest if I didn't say that I'm really concerned, and I think we have to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. And I hope that's not just a platitude.
I think the election year, every time, but particularly this time, feels scary to approach, because we don't know what the change is going to be, if there will be a change. And in either scenario, we're not necessarily like the winners, right? Both parties are kind of supported by this imperial idea of the United States that kind of puts it as a superpower and just takes for granted that things in the United States are secure and stable. But that's not always the case. We saw with like the January 6th riots, the insurrection, that things here are not so stable. In either way, it's not necessarily the best outcome, or an outcome that supports the people living on the ground here and elsewhere. Like, we see the United States impact all over the world. It's not just about domestic issues, it's about how we affect the people in Palestine and how we're affecting the people in Hong Kong and places like this. And all these issues going on around the world, they're deeply connected and they're rooted in the same problems. And at Weave News, that's something we grapple with a lot, we talk about a lot, is that these local issues are also global issues, and these global issues are also local issues, and they're all kind of founded in the same structural problems. And if you are not paying attention to your local context, you're missing a huge part of the story. And if you're not paying attention to the global context and these events happening elsewhere, you're not getting the whole story. And the corporate media will often not show you those things. And so storytelling is really important from like a personal role. What you have to say matters. And so going up to the election, I mean, there's like a number of things I'm really concerned about. I'm really concerned about domestically, like student debt. That's an issue that's really personal to me and is bearing really heavily on my conscience. I'm thinking about women's rights and LGBTQ rights. I'm also thinking about environmental rights, and how we have access to the public spaces around us and how those spaces are limited from place to place. I mean, just even like coming here to Philadelphia, I realized how little of this space was committed to public use. Like, I've struggled to find parks, I've struggled to find benches to sit on and that sort of thing. And those things matter. It matters what is in your community. And those things seem disconnected from the presidential election, but they're not. They're deeply rooted in the same problems. And so I just think it's really difficult to boil down the issues to one issue when they're so deeply enmeshed in each other.
The issues of disinformation and misinformation are huge. But I think that even the way we talk about disinformation and misinformation, I mean, what I'm ultimately concerned about is that we want a society that is democratic. We want a society that is not oppressive around issues of gender or race. We want a society that is not destroying the environment that we live on, that we rely, and also subjecting some of the people who have the least input into that environment, are facing some of the worst consequences. So we don't want that. And so in some ways, it's not just that we want We don't want disinformation and misinformation. We don't want the disinformation and misinformation to lead to a more oppressive world. So I think that the election is a key moment where all those things are going to gain steam. The institutions that produce disinformation and misinformation. One thing I will say is, in the last election, there was a big concern around, in some ways, someone like Donald Trump gave the media the rhetoric to be worried about like Russian bots and all these other kinds of things. But I think that that's actually not how disinformation functions right now. You have very prominent institutions who have commodified disinformation and are actually deploying it in very systematic ways for profit. And so it's, I think we need to look very closely at what the evolving structures of disinformation are. But that's one concern. Another concern I have is that, I will say that as an African American, one of the things I see is that Black political figures and Black figures in business are kind of used, I think, sometimes in a way that mystifies how power actually works. So, for example, we've had, we've seen like Black mayors be elected in certain places, or win primaries. We've had like Black police commissioners. And then even at the federal level, we've seen someone like Joe Biden and Donald Trump, both, we've seen the Republican Party and the Democratic Party recruit high-level people of color to sort of represent their agenda. So one thing I think about critical media literacy that's important is to get people to ask the right questions, right? To not necessarily, as my friend A.D. Carson said, to not necessarily just ask like who has a seat at the table, but to ask what are they serving at the table. You know what I mean? Because what I don't need necessarily, what I don't think gets us very far is to have Black political officials or even Black CEOs or whatever that are rolling out the same oppressive policies to the masses of Black people. Women leaders who are rolling out the same oppressive policies and class inequality to most of the women in the company and in the world, right? The last issue I want to put at the table is something that I'm really puzzled by, but I think critical media literacy plays an absolutely central role here. The way we talk about race and the way we talk about gender, I think, and maybe I'll be more specific, the way that I think people who have a progressive or radical political orientation, we talk about race and gender in certain ways. For example, we talk about something called toxic masculinity. Now, I think toxic masculinity is real, and I think any man who just looks at how you were brought up, lessons you were taught, and some of the issues in your family has to acknowledge it's real. But I also think that we have a way of talking about some of these issues that I don't want to say we're alienating large parts of the population, but I will say that people who have not, had like a course in feminism that really interrogates masculinity are confused by some of this stuff. There's a lot of men who don't understand what they're supposed to be doing as a man right now. And I think that a lot of really dark forces are taking advantage of that. And I think that that's the same applies to race. The way people understand race, there's a lot of white people who feel like suddenly they're victims, and they see any call for racial equality as like some people want to take something from them. People want them to feel terrible about who they are. And I mean, look, I do feel like the objective reality about America is that you have to feel terrible about where this country has been. I mean, at best, you can be like, I want to hope for this country to be something better. But my point is that I see an increasing number of people who have those concerns, and I'm not sure if the way that people who have a progressive political focus are talking in ways that relate to those people. And I think that critical media literacy has a role to play with sort of helping people to understand what do some of those concepts mean? What questions, if you want to think critically about something, what questions should you be asking?
It's a very, very difficult time now. You're taping this during an incredibly horrible war that's going on. It's making me and everyone else in the world very tired. But starting here, I think that we should always look for the openings. One of the things that's very clear is not only has there been a concentration of dominant corporate media and information, but there's also been a flowering of other sources of information. whether that's independent journalists, public service journalists, even journalists within legacy news are many of them are doing wonderful jobs. But I think even more so, the advocacy, social movement groups who are producing really, really good news and information. So what I think is necessary is to direct our students to learning from them, learn from the best, learn from the people who are producing really, really high quality work. And the second thing I think is really, really important is for us to realize that our students are already making media. So how do we enlist them now to learn how to construct useful information about themselves, about about other youth, about the kinds of communities that they work in. So they're not just sort of passive receivers of information. They're not just learning how to be critics, which is important, but even more so, they're learning how to create and construct knowledge that's really, really important to share. And they're learning how to not only construct it and make media that tells us about their perspectives, which are really valuable, and those of the communities in which they live, but also figure out how to share it, how to distribute it, how to use their various stand groups or social media groups to circulate valid evidence-based information that we're not getting anywhere else. So I think we need to use the youth networks that are already established and the youth skills that they are growing to build from those places and find the cracks in the future.
In terms of hopes or concerns for the 2024 election, I think I pretty much highlighted that, but my hope is that more people see the dire situation that we're in, that this is not the most important election of our lifetimes, because every election of my lifetime has been the most important one and it hasn't. I hope people see the limitations of electoralism and the importance of independent journalism and a free press allowing us to access the importance of our world and our life outside of electoralism, the importance of direct action, the importance of community organizing. These are terms and ideas that you will never hear on corporate media. So how can we engage in these things and actually push real change? Because honestly, if you look historically, there's never been any significant change, good change that has happened in our country or others because people checked a box. So I think we need to be real about it. And we need to hit the streets, get out into the trees, out into the rivers, wherever we can throw a wrench into the status quo, into the dealings and the workings of this system as it grinds ecosystems and people to a pulp. So that's my hope, my sort of jagged hope.
I'm going to say what I always say and what I've been pushing for many years now. It is so crucial for us as educators to consume alternative media, show our students where to find alternative media, and not to forget, to remember to fund alternative media. We need sources of information that are going to counter the status quo, that are going to hold those in power to account, that are going to show us alternate viable futures, that are going to show different angles and viewpoints that you don't find elsewhere. And I know that I know how powerful this is, because myself as an undergraduate was introduced to a few sources of alternative media by a fellow student, and it has changed my life ever since. And oftentimes when I introduce other people to alternative sources of news, it completely changes them. I have people come back to me and say, wow, I didn't know news could look like that. I didn't know I could learn from the news, you know? I think a lot of people realize, like, the corporate news is fundamentally defective, but they don't realize how or why. And that's why going back to critical media literacy, it gives you the tools to dissect the corporate media and to understand what is so defective about it.
So I am going to try to give you an optimistic answer. I'm going to try to focus on what we have seen in the last election cycle that was pivotal, that we saw women of color in particular really leading the charge and helping make positive change for our society. And while all that burden should not be on them, they are wonderful role models for the rest of us to think about what we need to do to make sure that everyone in our society has a voice, to make sure that everyone in our society is treated like a human being. And I think that we can take those lessons from previous elections, not be complacent, and work to be the change that we want to see in the world. Not to speak in platitudes, but we do have that potential if we're willing to do the hard work. It's not easy, it's not guaranteed, but we do have examples of it working, and it gives me hope for the future that we can try to repeat that again.
So some of my main issues of concern regard the treatment of the Julian Assange case and what that means for journalism worldwide, but especially in the United States. The way whistleblowers are treated. I'm concerned about the way that archaic laws are being invoked to shut people down, to shut journalists down. Those are big concerns.
Elections don't matter, I think, as much as we say they matter. We have, a warped sense of elections that somehow we're going to be able just to elect the right person at the right time and all the problems will be solved. Really, electoral politics is about voting in the person you think you have the best shot of agitating and annoying to get to do what you want. And you can look at what we're seeing as the two candidates, and you can decide what your agenda is and who you think has a better shot of agitating and annoying to get to do what you want. So I don't get too excited about elections or who wins or who loses. What I look for is, what are the activist community doing? Who's out there in the streets putting pressure on these people in positions of power? And in that sense, I really see a lot of the energy in folks who are pro-choice. We've seen historic electoral outcomes since the Dobbs decisions in places like Kansas and Kentucky and elsewhere, where these ruby red states are producing victories for liberals and Team Blue and the Democrats. And so I think that's where a lot of the energy is. So I'm more interested in sort of focused on those people who are hitting the streets and trying to pressure elected officials or have passion about particular policies. The politicians, for me, they're just, they're there to distract us.
I don't have really any hope for the upcoming election year. This is being filmed on October 27th, and we're currently in the midst of a horrific crisis in the Middle East, one that the US is actively participating in. And so my faith in the American government is gone. However, I do have faith in people, and I think people are beginning to recognize that the Fourth Estate does not work for us. It works to continue the interests of the establishment and the interests of Western nations. But it has been really inspiring for me seeing, historic levels of mobilization, not only across the country, but throughout the world. And that's not exclusive to the crisis in Gaza. Throughout this year, I think people have really started to wake up, and I think that there has been a wave of class consciousness and, seeing workers mobilize and unionize across all industries has really given me more hope for the future. But things still look pretty bleak, but I have faith in humanity, but I feel like, my faith in the government is completely gone.
I've been very concerned with the restrictions on voting in numerous states, which have done everything to make it more difficult to do mail-in voting. Simply restricted the amount of voting sites so that there are long lines of voting. All of these things contribute to hardships on the part of voters, which should be a much easier process. The mainstream media do not really call these things out in meaningful ways. Like, these are often Jim Crow laws. So these are often deliberately designed to keep low-income and African-American voters away from the polls and really block them out of having their voices heard in elections. And when it is reported on, it's simply a legal kind of thing, and this is what the Democrats say, and this is what the Republicans say, in this kind of both sidesing of the political parties, which becomes, normalizes this type of activity without saying, this is unconstitutional, this should not be happening. Don't just quote what the Democrats say or one group calls attention to it. Really tell the American people what this is about. This is about restricting your right to have a say in the political process. And it seems that corporate media seem to find their readers and viewers as much the enemy as the political elites at times, when they won't tell them the truth and they just go along with all of the negativity in campaigns, which are known to turn people off and prevent people from voting because they don't want to have anything to do with either of these candidates. So everything about this media-driven and restrictive-driven voting process is preventing America from having real meaningful elections in a representative democracy.
I guess for this upcoming election and all elections, I worry about voter suppression, that, you know, everybody that wants to vote is able to cast their vote free from intimidation and, you know, structural discriminatory barriers, and that the very people who are supposed to serve the people are in many ways making it more difficult to participate in elections in states like North Carolina, Ohio, Georgia, Florida, others. And as we know, these unfair policies disproportionately affect people of color. So there's you know, that concern. My hope is that people understand that there are journalists and reporters whose mission is to serve the public, tell the truth, hold, you know, people accountable, people in power accountable. And, you know, they may not be where you were looking previously. So it's important now to seek out, you know, independent news sources who have a proven track record of covering issues that are ignored by the establishment press, and, you know, support those outlets whenever possible. And, you know, I don't know. I mean, you know, civic engagement, as I've said before, goes beyond electoral elections. There are so many ways to stay engaged politically: organizing, protesting, writing, reading, thinking critically about how you consume media and how you share things, you know, with your communities, with your families, with your friends, via social media or wherever. And that's all important, and it will all still be important long after this election is over.
My biggest issue of concern is that we won't have a real choice at the ballot. And I'm not just talking about the presidential election, although I think that's what everybody thinks about the minute they think about elections. My primary concern is down the ballot, we're not going to be faced with choices, because even though we call our political system a democracy, if you look around the country, there's only a handful of truly competitive races. Because in most places, districts have been gerrymandered in such a way that you know, seats in the legislature or in the city council or in Congress are gerrymandered as safe seats, right? So they're safe for one party or another, and this is by design. So I'm concerned, first of all, about the fact that people won't be faced with real choices when they go to the ballot. Secondly, I'm concerned about people's ability to exercise the right to vote, because all over the country, especially in Republican-dominated so-called red states, there are all these voter suppression laws that have been passed that require people to present a certain form of ID, that disenfranchise people who have been convicted of a felony, etc. And these are incredibly racist. So they're designed to suppress the black vote primarily, but also, you know, votes by, you know, immigrant groups and so on, people who are naturalized immigrants. I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned about the fact that people will not be able to exercise the right to vote. And then finally, to circle back to the media, I'm concerned about how our media system, which is so obsessed with sensationalism, corporate media system, so obsessed with sensationalism, it has such sort of skewed priorities in the way that it frames political debates, is going to cover the election. I will be honest that there have been elections where I can't even bear to watch like television news or listen to commercial radio news, or even pick up certain newspapers, just because of the kind of idiotic way that they are framing the discussions and the debates, where they're just missing crucially important issues of environmental sustainability, peace, right, and anti-imperialism. Every year we have, or every time there's an election, we have an opportunity to have a debate, for example, about whether or not we want a military that is funded, that has a budget of $870 billion a year, whether or not we want to send almost $1 trillion to the Pentagon to pay for weapon systems in many cases that frankly don't work. Right? They don't. It's well known. It's well known that they don't work. So that is an issue that is never ever debated, right? Whether or not we should cut quote unquote defense spending, and that's a euphemism. It's military spending. Should we cut, whether or not we should cut weapons spending is something that is just not debated, and the corporate media is complicit in that, because they don't ask the reporters when they have a chance to confront politicians or candidates for office, do not ask those tough questions. And so that's my next big concern.
I just want these useful digital social media platforms are going to be used usefully and effectively. And because it's so rapidly circulated among younger people, so I think if we can use that strategically and really smartly, we can bring up some issues that have never gotten attention they deserve, something like the public school teachers or public sectors or first responders and other really emergent issues, climate change, of course. Yeah, because TikTok is all about fun, right? And I think we can use that platform for virality and other digital platforms featured.
Well, I think my main concern is that that depending on the outcome, the relationship between the US and Europe and maybe with the rest of the world may deteriorate due to the election outcome. And we've seen this already during the last Trump tenure. And I think people outside of the US and particularly in Germany are, I would say, slightly nervous about the electoral outcome. And from that point of view, I think it's even more important that that the media provide transparent, high quality and diverse information so that people can make informed decisions.